The Last Cyclist was written and rehearsed in the Terezin ghetto in 1944. It was a comedy, a daring, absurdist cabaret that made bicycle riders and anyone who sold them bikes or biking gear, or who had ancestors for several generations back who had anything at all to do with bicycles, the victims of a band of lunatics who've escaped from an asylum. As it develops, the plot gets increasingly silly and slapstick, at the same time that it becomes increasingly ominous. The lunatics are deporting cyclists to Horror Island, where they will be not so slowly starved to death. Ultimately, only the schlemiel of a hero who has bought a bike to impress his girlfriend remains. Everyone involved with The Last Cyclist in Terezin, and everyone who saw its rehearsals, understood that this was a thinly veiled allegory. The Nazis were the lunatics, and the bike riders, of course, were the Jews.
Speak into the microphone.
Sorry. Thank you. Is this better?
Yes.
Okay. The Nazis had an astounding 20,000 concentration camps spread across Europe, gathering places, transit points, and slave labor facilities where Jews and other so-called undesirables, political prisoners, gays, Roma, were held until they died or were sent to be murdered. One of them was Terezin, known in German as Theresienstadt. Terezin was a dreadful place, although obviously a virtual paradise compared to the 6 death camps on Polish soil. At its most crowded, 50,000 prisoners were crammed into a place meant to house 6,000 people. Families were divided. There were barracks for men, barracks for women, barracks for children. Approximately 60 people slept crowded into 3 tiers of bunks in each poorly heated dormitory space. As many as 400 people shared a single toilet, and more often than not, the toilets were backed up and overflowing. Dysentery and typhus were rampant. The inmates were fed a soup consisting mainly of potatoes, cabbage, and turnips, with almost no protein. People lined up for these bare subsistence meals, holding their spoon and mug, and then ate standing up whatever was ladled out to them. Yet they still had to work 10 hours every single day of the week. In such an environment, what would normally be insignificant assumed overwhelming importance. Losing a spoon or breaking a shoelace was nearly catastrophic. In this way, Terezin was like all the other concentration camps. But Terezin was also unique. It is only 40 miles from the cultured, beautiful city of Prague. As part of their hideously cynical pattern of deception, the Nazis told the Jews they were rounding up, particularly the elderly, well-to-do Jews in Germany, that they were being taken to a place where they would be protected during the war, that they were going to a spa, and people believed them. Most of the intellectual Jewish cream of Central European society, painters, writers, actors and directors of stage and screen, composers, musicians and scholars, people whose disappearance might have raised an international outcry, were interned at Terezin, and almost all of them contributed one way or another to the extraordinary flourishing of culture in this most unlikely of places. The SS didn't care what went on in the camp, so long as it didn't involve overt acts of subversion or sabotage. As a result, Terezin was artistically the freest place in all of occupied Europe. And the Nazis exploited that, making Terezin a show camp for the outside world. They spent months preparing for a 1944 visit by the International Red Cross that succeeded in keeping the truth from world leaders who should have known better or who willfully deceived themselves, and then forced inmates to create a propaganda film called Hitler Gives the Jews a Town. Everyone involved in that was sent off to be killed the next day. Against all odds, the Jews in Terezin managed to have an artistic and intellectual life so fierce, so determined, so vibrant, so fertile as to be almost unimaginable. It was a reminder that we are human beings and we remain human beings despite everything. One survivor wrote, "People were dying, transports were departing. If an actor didn't turn up for a rehearsal, he was gone. We didn't know to where." And that's very important. They didn't know to where. Yet we continued to stubbornly connect whatever we were doing with some happy future. Reality and the theater were completely separate things. And another wrote, "Hardly anywhere in the world was there such a grateful audience as in the attics of Terezin. Hardly a single actor anywhere else has ever been rewarded for his endeavors by such love from his public. We had a great hunger for culture in a place where there was not even enough bread to eat. Is it strange to think of theater in the concentration camps, or art, or music? Poetry recitations and storytelling took place even in the worst of the camps. In Terezin, an amazing range of cultural offerings was staged between 1942 and 1945. Operas, chamber music, plays, and cabarets. We know the titles of 2,430 lectures given in the camp and the names of the people who presented them. And all of this took place despite and complicated by grueling work schedules, debilitating hunger, illness, and death. The Jews interned in Terezin knew nothing about Auschwitz and the other death camps. How could they? They had no way of learning anything about what went on outside the camp, and besides, there had never before been a genocide attempt on so great a scale. I first encountered The Last Cyclist in 1995. My husband is a rabbi, and over the years our congregation in New Jersey hosted a series of arts weekends for Jewish high school students in our regional youth organization. That year, the subject was the Jews of Czechoslovakia. At my husband's request, I wrote a short, very simple, staged reading based on a description of a cabaret called The Last Cyclist that we found in a book about Terezin, published in 1965 by the Council of Jewish Communities in the Czech lands. The description is part of a chapter called Theater and Cabaret in the ghetto of Terezin. It was written by a woman named Jana Shedova, and it was the only plot summary in her entire essay. She explained that The Last Cyclist had been banned following its dress rehearsal, and she called it our most courageous production. The powerful story of The Last Cyclist stayed with me. I made various unsuccessful attempts to track down the original script. Finally, in 1999, a Czech friend found for me an unbound typescript of The Last Cyclist in the library of the Theatre Institute in Prague. When I had the script translated from Czech into English, I was shocked. The second act was radically different from the plot summary in that 1965 book on Terezin. This wasn't the original script at all. It turned out that what I had in my hands was an unpublished 1961 recreation of the original. Jana Shedova, who wrote the chapter on theater in that book on Terezin, was apparently the only survivor of the Terezin cast of The Last Cyclist. And she and a colleague, a man named Darek Vostrel, had adapted the cabaret for a production at the Avant-Garde Rococo Theater in Prague, which is still in existence, by the way, in honor of the 40th anniversary of the Czech Communist Party. It's impossible at this point to know how closely the Shedova-Vostrel script accords with Schwenk's, not only because it was reconstructed some 20 years later from memory, but also because the new version needed to speak in ideologically acceptable language to Czech communists of the early 1960s. Shedova wrote, "Based on the outline of thoughts and actions of the original cabaret, we tried to dramatize the senselessness and danger of all kinds of racism to people of the year 1961, just as Karl Schwenk had done with his group of prisoners in the Terezin attic in 1944. I struggled with what to do with the cyclist script, now that I knew for certain it wasn't the original written in Terezin. Ultimately, I decided the subject was too important to drop and too compelling not to present as a play. By 2009, with a lot of not working on it in between, I had created what I described as a reconstruction and reimagining of the original, which I have tweaked and revised virtually every time I've seen the play performed. It's been mounted in staged readings, in performances at community theaters, in synagogues, high schools and colleges, at Holocaust museums, in a Spanish translation by 2 different groups in Mexico City, and in the wonderful off-Broadway production directed by Edward Einhorn, whose presentation is going to follow me this afternoon. In a wonderful off-Broadway production, well received both in the New York Times and by the AP. The play has also been on the syllabus of courses on theater and genocide at Tufts, the University of Kansas, the University of Indiana, and Drew. At the end of August 2017, we captured on film a staged production of The Last Cyclist at La Mama, for which Edward was again my director. Let me share with you now a short clip from one of the opening scenes of the film. It dramatizes a bitter joke that made the rounds among Jews in Europe between the First and Second World Wars.
My fellow citizens, our country is in crisis. We must rid ourselves of the monstrous perversion that is destroying society. Who is to blame for all of our troubles? The Jews and the cyclists. Who is destroying our economy and robbing our wives and children? The Jews
And the cyclists.
Who is a parasite on the body of the nation? The Jews.
And the cyclists.
Who is undermining our proud spirit with the violent and conniving? The Jews.
And the cyclists.
Why the cyclists?
Why the Jews?
I've been told by Czech friends that the cyclists and the Jews was a kind of catchphrase they grew up hearing, no doubt spoken with a shrug that implied, we're blamed for everything else, why not this too? Hannah Arendt mentions the joke in The Origins of Totalitarianism, and Bertolt Brecht references it in The Irresistible Rise of Umberto Oui. I believe it was the inspiration for the play The Last Cyclist. I haven't said anything yet about the man who wrote it. Karl Schwenk, who is described in survivor memoirs as having been a cross between Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton, was one of the pioneers of the avant-garde theater in Prague before the war. He was actor, director, playwright, and composer, and a leading member of a traveling troupe known as the Theater of Needless Talents. Schwenk was one of 342 men who were arrested, deported to Terezin on the first transport, young men sent to convert the old walled Austro-Hungarian military garrison into a concentration camp. Early in 1942, after only a few months in Terezin, he wrote his first cabaret. It was called The Lost Food Card. Imagine what the lost food card as a whole play meant in terms of survival needs. The show ended with a song that became known as the Terezin March. It spoke to the prisoners' situation and to their hopes for a brighter future. Soon we will be homeward bound, the chorus promises. On the ruins of the ghetto, we will laugh. The song became the unofficial anthem of the camp and was reprised by audience demand in all of Schwenk's later productions and on every other possible occasion. The lyrics appear in full in more than one survivor memoir. Schwenk wrote 4 or 5 other plays in the camp. All but The Last Cyclist were performed as much as 40 times. The Last Cyclist was banned immediately after its dress rehearsal. The Jewish Council of Elders was afraid of SS reprisals because the satire was so explicit and its references to the irrational behavior of Hitler and his followers so blatantly and transparently anti-Nazi. The cabaret may have continued to be performed secretly in the barracks by 1 or 2 actors as a reading, or somehow become part of Schwenk's next cabaret, which was called The Same But Different, but we don't know for certain. No doubt the fact that it was one of only 2 productions so banned, the other was the opera The Emperor of Atlantis by Victor Ullmann, contributed to its mystique and therefore its being remembered. On October 1st, 1944, Schwenk was among the hundreds of people sent in cattle cars from Terezin to Auschwitz. It was the second time his name had appeared on a transport list. The first time he gave all his manuscripts to a friend to preserve, and then he wasn't called for the transport. This time, he took his writings with him. He was among a group of men deemed by the Nazis still able to work, and so they were transferred from Auschwitz to a subcamp of the infamous concentration camp known as Buchenwald, and set at brutally hard labor. In April 1945, Schwenk was among the thousands of prisoners sent on a long death march. It was just before the end of the war in Europe, and in yet another attempt at deception, the Nazis were trying to hide from the advancing Red Army the hideous evidence of what they had been doing to the Jews. Karl Schwenk died of exhaustion and starvation somewhere along the march, and his manuscripts were gone forever. He was 28 years old. A few years ago, I was asked by a reviewer how much of my script was taken from the translation I received and how much of it was my original work. I was surprised to discover how difficult it was for me to answer. I really couldn't clearly separate the strands anymore because so many of the changes had come about organically. They happened because they were logical developments from one step to another. But here, more or less, is what I determined. For starters, my Czech translator's English was imperfect, stilted, and British rather than American in orientation. So my first job was to radically revise much of the language to make it flow. That was the easy part. At that point, the play was in 2 acts, the second of which was radically different from Shadova's 1965 description of Schwenk's original. Just to be certain, in case I haven't made this clear, and it is a little confusing, the plot summary Shadova put into the essay she wrote for the 1965 book describes the plot of The Last Cyclist Cabaret, written by Karl Schwenk in the Terezin ghetto in 1944, not what she and Darek Vostrel had written and performed in 1961 in Prague. I do say the second act was very different. I spent time closely comparing Shadova's 1965 summary of Schwenk's Cabaret with Act 2 of her 1961 script. I was particularly struck by the existence, in my research, of a major Soviet attempt in the early 1960s to bring Asian and African countries into the Soviet orbit, and how that had influenced Schwenk's and Vostrel's plot decisions. Clearly, a production in honor of the anniversary of the party had to speak in party language and to party goals, and it was daring even to talk about Jews or about the Holocaust in Czechoslovakia in the early 1960s, and yet that theme provided the basic plot of the play. I wish I had time to tell you about the weird aberrations of their 1961 script, but there really isn't time now. Trust me, it was very strange. The first act of the 1961 play ran pretty true to Schwenk's Cabaret as described in Shadova's essay, and I was able to begin to develop the action and dialogue to lead to the climax and the denouement of the Terezin original. I'd begun to feel comfortable enough with the style of the 1961 version to start shaping a second act that would draw logical plot conclusions based on the first act written in Terezin. Wherever possible, I used both plot and dialogue from the 1961 version. I could see how Shadova and Vostrel had adapted the original concepts to create their script, which made my own adaptation that much easier to do. With a certain amount of trepidation, yet knowing it was necessary, I jettisoned their ending, their weird ending, in favor of the ending of the 1944 Cabaret, as Shadova had described it in the 1965 essay. Much, much later, after many productions of the play, I cut out a scene I loved, and on which I'd worked very hard, because I finally realized that it unequivocally reflected the 1960s communist outreach initiative rather than the concerns of the Jews in Terezin in 1944. I read as much as I could about survivors' recollections of Schwenk and of The Last Cyclist itself. I also examined drawings for The Last Cyclist by František Zelenka. Zelenka was a brilliant artist who designed the sets and costumes for virtually every production in the camp. He did incredible magic with bed sheets and blankets and tin cans and butcher paper and charcoal. The sketches themselves, which are in the collection of the National Museum in Prague, offer some clues to the plot. For instance, there must have been a scene in which prisoners are being transported to Harrer Island, because one of Zelenka's drawings is of a naval officer. Another is a set design for a laboratory where scientists are working on a machine that will turn cyclists into pedestrians. That scene is also referenced in an interview that Yana Shadova gave later in her life, where she talks about it being particularly funny, but doesn't give any details. I saw no point in trying to reimagine those scenes without a greater sense of their purpose, especially since my play was already long. Instead, I referenced them in the dialogue in a way that I believe, I hope, enriches the script. Finally, I was able, slowly, to remove bits of dialogue and in-jokes that no doubt were hilarious in the Terezin ghetto, but made no sense to me after all my research, and therefore were unlikely to make sense to my audiences. I found it very hard to delete anything, because the script had assumed a kind of holiness for me. I was torn between an almost overwhelming sense of obligation to remain true to the original, and the need to make the play relevant and appealing to a contemporary audience. I showed my script to a number of friends, Holocaust scholars, editors, actors, and playwrights, and each gave me his or her critique. I incorporated most of their excellent suggestions into my script, but neither they nor I realized that something basic was missing until I showed the script to a director whom I was hoping to interest in mounting a production. "I thought you said this play was about the Holocaust," he said, "but it isn't." And in effect, he was right, because after all, neither the Schwenk Cabaret nor the Shadova play talks about the Holocaust or Terezin. The Jews in Terezin didn't need to be reminded. They knew where they were and what they were suffering. What they needed was to be entertained. And this particular entertainment, additionally, offered a frisson of resistance. In 1961, it was important to Shadova and Vostrel to universalize the story as much as possible. For the play to work, it needed a context, a framework. So I created both an entirely new beginning, a monologue delivered by an older Yana Shedova many years later, after the Holocaust, and a dress rehearsal scene, which remains in the play version but has been largely dropped from the film, and also the current ending. Here's a piece of that ending. Without the sound. Wait, what happened to the sound?
Politics is over!
Go home, he says.
No! The end has come only here on the stage. Out there where you are, out in the world, the rule of madness continues.
The Jews and the cyclists are to blame for all of our misfortunes. Why the cyclists? Why the Jews?
Because Schwenk's Terezin March was such an important morale builder for the prisoners, I made it the triumphant song the cast sings when the lunatics are defeated, to bring the audience back to the reality of the concentration camp. And it's strange because I've discovered over the years, over the performances, something I never expected, which is that audiences get so involved in the story of the cyclists and lunatics that they forget that this is taking place in a concentration camp, for being performed by concentration camp inmates. So the song is interrupted with and broken by the announcement the new deportation lists have been posted. The new deportation lists have been posted. There's additional scene, but I'm leaving that out for now. I've made numbers of small significant changes over the years, some to deal with things I became unhappy about when watching a performance, and some to incorporate what I saw as brilliant directorial touches or inspired actors' choices. I hadn't initially given names to the Terezin inmate actors. I was worried it would be a clumsy overlay because the actors were playing multiple roles in the play within a play, but I was wrong. I hadn't anticipated the degree to which the actors identify with the Terezin inmates whose parts they are playing. The prisoners become real to them. Cast members, artists, and members of the crew, professionals and amateurs, research and share with each other and with me information about Terezin that they find in books and on the internet. We aren't doing this for ourselves, they tell me when I compliment them on their performance. We're not even doing it for you. We've got to get it right for them. My involvement with The Last Cyclist continues to feel to me like an awesome responsibility. It's my homage to Karl Schwenk, whose subversive humor and biting wit made him a hero, a legend to the Jews in Terezin. Using laughter and satire as his most potent weapons, he helped them forget, if only for a moment, the hunger, degradation, death, and deportations to the east that were the reality of their existence in Terezin. As Yana Shedova wrote, theatrical performances in Terezin were a gift beyond imagining. Let me show you one more scene. It's from early in the film. It introduces into the plot the hero's purchase of a bicycle to impress his girlfriend, which leads to his becoming the chief cyclist scapegoat in the eyes of the lunatics. A particularly ludicrous element of this scene is the attempt of Mr. Opportunist to sell the hero an insurance policy, just about the last thing the prisoners in Terezin could have imagined needing at that point.
What a glorious group of women, don't you think so? Uh-huh. The best gymnasts in the nation parading right before our eyes. My dear Oblivion, you must congratulate me. I've now sold my 100th life insurance policy. 100 more people whose lives are now insured, whose families will not suffer financial hardship. Yours truly has done an excellent service for humanity. And certainly get a nice little promotion for it, too.
I'm sure Monichka's here somewhere.
You see that fat girl? Or that one with the enormous nose?
Oh no, much better looking. Oh, there she is now. There she is. Monichka's coming. There, that adorable one.
All of them look good to me. But he's right, that one looks particularly desirable.
Monichka, listen to me. I will buy you a bicycle.
You'd buy a bike?
Would I? Yes, indeed. I'm going we can buy a bike.
I can sell you one.
I can't see Monica anymore.
Nothing special.
I disagree. She's very special. She looks splendid.
Not Manichka, the bike, the bike. Pay attention, man. Now listen, it isn't the newest, but it works.
Oh, did you see her wave to me? What an extraordinary woman.
Well, will you buy it?
As sure as my name is Obelisk.
I will bring the bike to your place tomorrow.
Wrap it up well. I want it to be a surprise.
And when will you marry her, Mr. Abeles?
Oh, maybe next week. I can't this week. I'm taking inventory in the store.
Makes sense. Business before pleasure. Otherwise, you'd be too distracted to count your money. And what about children? Have they already been had? Are they being made? Or are they yet to come?
Yet to come.
Montesquieu wants that 2, and I want 3.
So
That's 5 altogether.
quintuplets!
Obelisk, you must get yourself insured. Listen, you just bought yourself a bike, huh? What if the man who sold it to you is a rogue? You'll sit on the bike, it'll fall apart, you'll scrape your knees, you'll break your nose, and get yourself killed tomorrow. What preparations have you made for your poor orphan children? The little darlings. Do you want them to be born as posthumous babies? You owe it to Monica to get life insurance.
Is that where you want to go to, or you want to?
Sure, let's stop there. The inmates, I'm sorry.
I was a minute short. I'm sorry.
All right, well,
You want me to-
I don't know, we're running out of your time.
I think we have a minute.
Okay. As the director, he's decided he'll skip a minute.
You don't have any children yet? But you will soon, Obelisk. You will very soon indeed. I saw the way you looked at her. You owe it to Monica to get life insurance.
For Monica, I will do anything.
Monica.
The inmates who attended the open rehearsals of The Last Cyclist in Terezin laughed, and we laughed too. But ours is uncomfortable laughter, because The Last Cyclist, for all its humor, is not a joke, but a brave protest against totalitarianism. We are awed by the extraordinary courage of people whose resilience enabled them to withstand the degradation in which they were forced to live. And we know the fate of the cast and the rest of the 6 million Jews murdered during the Holocaust. It's my hope that The Last Cyclist, in a non-confrontational way, helps make clear why it is the personal responsibility of every honorable human being to fight the intolerance, prejudice, bullying, and racism that threaten people everywhere today.
So I'm just going to quickly talk about how I got involved in working on theater in Terezin. And you just saw The Last Cyclist, which is one of the projects I've worked at. I've actually been working on Jewish and Czech theater for a long time, and they sort of combined to bring me into this world of theater from Terezin. I ran a theater conference here of my own about in 2009 with the Alliance for Jewish Theater, and I was executive director there for a while. And then I also worked with Václav Havel, and I ran a festival of his work that he participated in 2006. And so it sort of made sense when Naomi started asking about somebody who was interested in this sort of work, and Lisa Peschel, who some of you may know, was also looking for somebody, and around pretty much simultaneously they both approached me about directing some work that was done in Terezin. Lisa's work actually eventually transformed into a cabaret that I've been producing yearly, usually around Yom HaShoah. It's called Cabaret in Captivity, and I'll be getting to that more in a moment. But first, I want to tell you a quick little anecdote that inspired the title of this talk. So a few years ago, I was taking a cab, and my cab driver asked me if I had any good ideas to help the world. He was collecting. He had just had a doctor in his cab, and who he felt had been very altruistic in his work, and so he wanted to see what I could do. So I said I work in theater, so most of the things I do are in that field, but I do think that art can help the world. And he sort of scoffed at that. He said, if you were starving, would you like food or would you want a flower? So this reminded me of another incident. Some years before that, a well-known New York bakery had promised my theater company a free cake for a fundraiser. The day I came to pick it up, the owner reneged. I didn't understand it was for theater, she told me. I thought it was for a charity. And I said, well, our theater is a nonprofit. And she said, no, I don't mean that. I mean something that does good in the world. Like cancer research. I just can't give a free cake to anyone who asks. These conversations dwelled with me for a while. The nature of American nonprofit theater is that it depends on donations. Personal donations, foundation donations, government grants, which are sort of a donation from everybody's tax dollar. So why do we deserve it? I could say without it, the world would be lacking. Only commercial work would survive. Difficult work that examines ideas or advances the art form wouldn't exist. The world would be a much duller and less joyful place. To me, but then again, I'm not starving. This is how I respond to the cab driver. I just directed a play called The Last Cyclist, written during the Holocaust in an internment camp called Terezin. All the actors were starving. The play criticized the Nazis, and although they were allowed to rehearse it, they didn't perform it for fear of reprisal. Most of them were eventually murdered. But during those rehearsals, they felt alive, and that's why they were doing it, to feel alive, to feel joy, which is why all artists do their work. Art, I believe, is a basic need, dating back to the cave drawings. I would like to think it betters humanity, but I make theater because I need to. Because when I do, I feel joy, and when I don't, I feel empty and unfulfilled. I did not know the inmates of Terezin, nor have I ever experienced what they experienced. What I do know is the joy of creating theater, and that is what my actors know, and my designers, and my stage manager, and everybody who works on the show. And if I do it well, that is what my audience knows as well. And that joy has always been the focus of my work on Terezin. Let me go back to Cabaret in Captivity, which I mentioned briefly earlier. It's a collection of work created in Terezin, presented in the spirit of the actual cabarets they held there. The work ranges from comic to the introspective, though the dark world around them is always an unspoken presence. So I'm going to play you one of the songs. It's called As If. It's a bittersweet yet comic song written by Leo Strauss and performed by a downtown cabaret performer named Jeremy Lawrence. Strauss was one of the older cabaret performers in the camp, and like Jeremy, he was an accomplished writer and musician with a career that spanned decades. This last clip is from last year's performance at a New York cabaret space called Pangea.
And now Leo Strauss is going to sing one for us right now.
I know a little town where the chosen people live. Its name is not important. I call it just as if. On a rainy day they act there just as if the sky was blue. Believing every lie is just as if the lies were true. The coffee house reminds them of the ones where they used to sit. And when the music plays, they all sigh, it's just as if. They drink their morning coffee just as if it wasn't fake. And goodness, every Saturday, it's just as if there's cake. They lie upon the the floor, just as if it were a bed. And it's just as if a dream would go dancing in their head. They wear their rags quite proudly, just as if they're ties and tails. Where make-believe is real, then the memory never fails. They talk about the towns just as if they all could move. I'll speak of better times, just as if things would improve. I know you'd like to go there, there's no need to raise your voice. But it's only for the chosen, just as if there was a choice. I know you'd like to go there, there's no need to raise your voice. But it's only for the chosen, just as if there was a choice.
So what I find remarkable about that work is that it brings us somehow through time to the emotions those inmates must have been feeling. Oh, wait, sorry. That's our next thing. Sorry. To the emotions those inmates must have been feeling. The comedy is full of despair, but it's still a comedy. It is the song of someone still determined to live and make the best of a situation despite everything, to find a way to laugh through the tears. Sometimes, of course, the tears take over, but the immediacy of those tears is only enhanced by the beauty of the music they created. The next song I'm going to share with you is by Ilse Weber, a woman who helped take care of the children in Terezin. Her songs were written for them. Eventually, she voluntarily went with her own children to Auschwitz because she couldn't bear the thought that they might face that journey alone. It's sung by Jenny Lee Mitchell, who has been my collaborator on this particular project, The Cabaret in Captivity, from the very beginning. You may, I don't know if we saw her in Last Cyclist, but she's in The Last Cyclist as well. Also singing is Alison Rosenfeld, who was another performer from The Last Cyclist, and Slovak cabaret singer Katerina Vivisnaya.
Ich denk im Dunkeln an dich, mein Kind, und sie die Berge und die
So last year, Jenny and I brought the whole cabaret to London. We've been lucky enough to have it a lot of different venues in the Czech Embassy in Washington, D.C., and about 5 or 6 different venues here in New York. But in London, we guided a student production, and many of them were studying opera or musical theater. They were students who came from all parts of the world. And some of them, like our pianist and violinist, who was from Malaysia, had never learned anything at all about the Holocaust. Incorporating them into the cabaret was an amazing experience for them and for me. You could just feel their connection to the material. Because everyone involved was a young artist of some sort, they deeply identified with the artists in Terezin. Most of them were studying music, not theater, but they possessed the same spirit as the theater professionals I worked with. Like the more seasoned performers in New York, they all felt the connection that I too felt. In similar circumstances, what else would we do but art? The Malaysian student is now working collaboratively, writing music for another Holocaust project for a Polish-Jewish student also in London. She will continue with that work even when she returns to Malaysia this year to work as a music teacher. So the next clip I'm going to play you is from that cabaret in London. It's an instrumental piece. It's called Serenada by Robert Dauber. He wrote quite a bit of music in Terezin, but this is unfortunately the only thing that survived. He was the cellist in Brundabar as well. Pei Yo, the Malaysian student whom I just mentioned, is on violin, and Jack Drummond, a Scottish student, is on piano. So the serenade, as you can hear, is a relatively light tune, but the context gives it poignancy, of course. It's a poignancy I know to expect, but it still takes me by surprise. It takes me by surprise right now. There are many reasons the context is important from a pedagogical or educational standpoint. But once again, I will speak from an artistic standpoint. In performance, the beauty and joy in the work becomes heroic. It does not become heroic because I or the actors choose to portray it that way. I'm sorry. I've been doing this for so many years and suddenly it just hit me. We are doing it, we're doing the show the best we know how. It becomes heroic because the audience knows what the performers themselves do not fully realize. They know the horror of the world in which the artists were living. The actors, composers, and writers in Terezin may not have meant their art as a sort of political resistance, though in some cases, like the Last Cyclist, I would argue that perhaps they did. But feeling joy and doing art is always an act of resistance. At the very least, it is resistance to misery. It is often a resistance to oppression, the oppression of society or life or fate. I know when I personally feel besieged in today's world, which I sometimes do, the rehearsal room is a sanctuary, a place to rediscover who I am and what it feels like to be human. I'm grateful for it. I need it too, in a different way perhaps than those in Terezin did, but then again in a related way. Just like I don't feel the hunger that they felt, and perhaps cannot imagine it, I can imagine great hunger. When your body is starving, you need food, and when your soul is starving, you need art.